Margaret Hale pressed her thin fingers into Naomi's shoulder and shoved her hard enough that the girl stumbled against the kitchen wall, sending a clay pot crashing to the floor. "Clean that up," Margaret said, not even looking back. "And if you break anything else before the rancher arrives, I'll make sure you sleep in the barn with the horses tonight." Naomi crouched down and began gathering the broken pieces with her bare hands. One shard sliced into her palm. She didn't make a sound. Her stepsister Delia leaned in the doorway, watching with a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. Maybe the barn would be an improvement. At least she'd smell like she belonged somewhere. Both women laughed. Margaret swept out of the kitchen in a cloud of lavender water, already rehearsing the smile she'd wear when the wealthy Colton Mercer arrived. Naomi pressed her bleeding hand against her apron and kept her eyes on the floor. But if you've ever been treated like you were invisible in your own home, like your worth was measured only by what you could carry, cook, or sacrifice, then this story is going to hit you somewhere deep. Stay with us until the very end, because nothing about what happens next goes the way anyone expects. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. We genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to that kitchen and to the woman no one thought was worth a second glance. The morning Colton Mercer rode into Sulphur Creek, Arizona, he was wearing a shirt with a fraying collar, boots that had seen 3 hard winters too many, and a hat with a crease in the brim where the felt had gone soft. He had a bedroll tied behind a mud-colored gelding and 3 days of stubble on his jaw. Nobody on the street gave him a second look, which was exactly what he wanted. He pulled his horse up outside the feed store and sat there a moment, watching the town move around him. A woman in a good dress walked past with her nose slightly elevated. 2 merchants negotiated over a barrel of nails. A boy of about 12 chased a runaway chicken through the gap between 2 buildings and nearly knocked over an elderly man who cursed at him in Spanish. Colton watched all of it. He had a habit of watching. It had served him well over the years, better than his money had in certain situations. He tied his horse to the rail and walked inside the feed store, ducking slightly under the doorframe out of habit, even though he didn't quite need to. The man behind the counter was heavy-set, with kind eyes and flour dust on his vest. "Passing through?" the man asked. "Might be," Colton said. "Looking for work. Heard there's a ranch a few miles out called Ashwood." The man's expression shifted just slightly. Not alarm exactly, more like the careful neutrality of a man who had opinions he'd decided not to share out loud. "Ashwood's the Hale property," the man said. "About 4 miles northeast. You want work, you'd have to talk to Margaret Hale. She runs the place now." He paused. "Her husband passed 2 years back." "What kind of outfit is it?" "Used to be a decent spread. Boyd Hale built it up from nothing. Good man, fair man." Another pause. "Things have changed some since he passed." Colton nodded slowly, letting the space fill without pushing into it. He'd learned that people told you more when you didn't press them. The feed store man rubbed the back of his neck. "They had some hired hands. Most of them have moved on." He said it the way people say things they know sound worse than they're letting on. "Any family still there?" "Margaret and her 2 daughters from her first marriage, and Boyd's daughter from his first wife, Naomi." He said the name differently than the others. Not softer exactly, but more deliberate, like a man who chose his words. "She's still out there." Colton paid for a small bag of grain he didn't need, thanked the man, and walked back out into the morning sun. 4 miles northeast. He rode slowly, the way a man rides when he's thinking rather than traveling. This was his 3rd such trip in 2 years. The first had been to a prosperous family in New Mexico whose eldest daughter had spent the entire dinner talking about what she intended to do with a large house once she had one. The second had been worse. A widow in Tucson who had treated her own servants so badly during the space of one afternoon that Colton had ridden out before supper was finished, making an excuse about his horse that nobody believed. He wasn't proud of the deception. He'd wrestled with it, to be honest. A man didn't lie about who he was without there being a cost somewhere. And Colton was old enough to know that the costs had a way of arriving when you least expected them. But he was 34 years old, his wife Clara had been dead for 6 years. And in 6 years, every woman who had shown interest in Colton Mercer had been interested, as far as he could tell, primarily in Mercer Ridge Ranch, in its acreage, its cattle count, its reputation across the territory. He'd sat across dinner tables from women who asked about his water rights before they asked about his family. He'd received letters from mothers listing their daughters' accomplishments alongside gentle inquiries about the current market price for beef. He didn't blame them for wanting security. He understood it. The frontier was hard, and life was uncertain, and a woman alone had few good options. He understood all of that, but he was tired of feeling like a transaction. So he'd started arriving first, quietly, in borrowed clothes, with a different name and a story about drifting and looking for work. He'd spend a few days watching, listening, learning who people actually were when they thought no one important was paying attention. Ashwood Ranch came into view around a bend in the road, a cluster of buildings set back from a dry creek bed, surrounded by scrub and sparse grassland. It wasn't a beautiful property. The fences needed work. One of the outbuildings had a section of collapsed roof that hadn't been repaired. The main house was solid enough, 2 stories with a covered porch, but the wood needed paint and several of the porch boards had warped. What caught his eye first was movement near the corral. A young woman in a work dress and worn boots was hauling a heavy water bucket across the yard, favoring her right arm slightly, as if she'd done it so many times that her left side had given up arguing. Her dark hair was pulled back and coming loose on one side. She set the bucket down at the trough, straightened up with her hands on her lower back, and looked at the sky for exactly 2 seconds. Not praying, not daydreaming, just the look of someone allowing themselves one brief moment of stillness before going back to work. Then she picked up the empty bucket and walked back toward the well. Colton watched her for a moment without moving. A door banged open on the main house and a woman's voice cut across the yard like a switch. "Naomi, the breakfast dishes are still sitting in that basin. What exactly have you been doing out here?" The young woman at the well didn't flinch. She called back in a measured voice, "Water the horses first, then dishes, same as every morning, Mrs. Hale." "Don't give me your logic. Just get it done." The door banged shut again. The young woman lowered the bucket into the well. She pulled it up, set it on the edge, and for just a moment she closed her eyes. Her jaw was tight. Then she opened her eyes again and carried the bucket back toward the trough. Colton touched his heels to his horse and rode forward. "Morning," he called out as he came through the gate. "I'm looking for work. Heard you might need a stable hand." She looked up at him. Direct, no hesitation in it, none of the performance that women sometimes gave around strangers, the downcast eyes and the slight smile and the careful distance. She just looked at him the way you look at a person to figure out if they mean what they say. "You'll want to talk to Mrs. Hale," she said. Her voice was even, neither warm nor cold, just honest. "She's in the house." "You're not the one in charge of hiring." Something crossed her face. Not quite bitterness, not quite humor. Hard to name exactly. "No, I'm not in charge of much." She went back to carrying her bucket. Colton tied his horse to the post and knocked on the door of the main house. Margaret Hale was not what he'd expected, which he supposed was fair, since he hadn't known what to expect. She was a handsome woman in her mid-40s, with sharp blue eyes and the kind of posture that had been drilled into her young and had hardened into something close to armor. She looked at him, at his clothes, at his boots, at his hat, with a practiced eye that filed him away in about 3 seconds. "Not important. Move on." "We don't need anyone," she said, already stepping back from the door. "I work hard," Colton said. "I'll take low wages. Just room and board to start. See if I'm useful." She paused. He watched her calculate. A man who'd work for almost nothing was still a body that could carry things, and the ranch was clearly short on bodies. He could see it in the untended state of every surface he could observe from the doorway. "What's your name?" "Eli Cross." She studied him another second. "You'll sleep in the bunkhouse. I'll give you 2 weeks' trial. Wages after that if you prove worth it." She said it like she was doing him a considerable favor. "Thank you, ma'am." She didn't say you're welcome, she just closed the door. Mistam. The bunkhouse held 4 beds and smelled of dust and old leather. There was nobody else in it. Colton set his bedroll on the nearest cot, washed his face in the basin, and went looking for something useful to do. What he found, over the course of that first afternoon, was that Ashwood Ranch ran almost entirely on the labor of one person. Naomi Hale, Boyd's daughter, the late rancher's child from his first wife, moved through that property like a woman who had made a private agreement with exhaustion and simply refused to lose the negotiation. She repaired a section of fence in the late morning, working methodically with a post-hole digger and wire that was slightly too old. She cleaned and reset a loose hinge on the barn door. She fed and watered the horses, all 6 of them. She hauled firewood. She made a trip to the kitchen and emerged an hour later with lunch, which she carried into the main house while her stepmother and stepsisters sat on the porch, not offering to help. From his position near the barn, Colton watched all of it. He picked up a spare post and walked over to where she was working on the fence. "Hand me the wire," he said. She stopped and looked at him. "You're supposed to be fixing the trough on the south side." "Trough's done." Another long look. Then she handed him the wire. They worked together for the next hour without much talk. He noticed that she had a methodical way of approaching a problem. She'd look at it first without touching it, figure out what it actually needed rather than what it seemed to need, and then work through it efficiently without wasted motion. It wasn't elegant. It was practical. The kind of intelligence that came from doing rather than planning. "You fixed fence before?" she asked at one point. "Once or twice," he said, which was something of an understatement. "You don't work like someone who's done it once or twice." He didn't answer that. She didn't press it. By the time they walked back toward the barn, the afternoon light had gone golden and the air had cooled slightly. He heard voices from the porch, her stepsisters, Delia and the younger one whose name he hadn't caught yet, debating something about a dress. "Naomi." One of the voices, Delia's, sharpened. "The water for my bath needs to be heated. I told you this morning." Naomi kept walking toward the barn without breaking stride. "I heard you this morning. I'll get to it." "You'll get to it now. I didn't ask for your schedule. I told you what I need." Naomi stopped. She was facing away from the porch toward the barn, and from where Colton stood he could see the side of her face. Her jaw tightened the same way it had tightened at the well that morning. Then it released. She turned around. "Yes, Delia," she said, and her voice was perfectly flat. Not angry, not subservient, just completely, carefully empty. She walked toward the house. Colton watched her go, and something moved in his chest that wasn't pity exactly. Pity would have been easier. This was something more uncomfortable, the recognition of a kind of strength that only existed in people who'd been given no other option. Chatham. 3 days into his time at Ashwood, he had the measure of the household. Margaret Hale was not a cruel woman by nature, he thought. She was a frightened one. Frightened of debt, frightened of status, frightened of what it meant to have built a life on someone else's property and then lost the someone. She expressed that fear as sharpness, as demand, as the constant rearranging of those around her to create the appearance of control. Delia, the elder stepsister, was 22 and pretty in the careful, maintained way of a woman who understood her prettiness to be a resource and guarded it accordingly. She wasn't unintelligent. Colton had caught moments where a real observation flickered behind her eyes, but she'd been taught that intelligence in a woman was less useful than the right appearance, and she'd accepted that lesson completely. The younger one was Cora, 19, softer than her sister, the kind of girl who might have been genuinely sweet if she'd grown up in a household where sweetness was modeled rather than punished. As it was, she followed Delia's lead the way younger siblings follow older ones, not because they agree, but because they don't yet have the vocabulary to disagree. And then there was Naomi. Naomi Hale was 26. He'd gotten that from the feed store man on a second visit. Casual question slipped into conversation. She'd been 12 when her father married Margaret, and 24 when Boyd Hale died. She hadn't been included in the will in any substantive way. He'd learned that more indirectly, from the particular way Margaret spoke of the ranch's finances, as if they were exclusively her problem, her burden, her decision to manage. Naomi never talked about money. She never talked about the will. She never, as far as Colton could observe, complained about anything at all. That by itself should have been suspicious, but it wasn't. Not the suspicious kind of silence, not the silence of someone who was calculating. It was the silence of someone who had decided, at some point, that speaking her situation aloud would not improve it, and had put her energy elsewhere. He found her in the barn early on the 4th morning, before the household was up, talking quietly to the oldest of the horses, a gray mare with a stiffness in her left foreleg. She favoring that leg long? He asked from the doorway, keeping his voice low. Naomi glanced over her shoulder. She was running her hand down the mare's leg, feeling for heat. 3 weeks, she said. It's not the tendon. I think it's the sole. Picked up something last month and I can't get it completely clear. He came into the barn and crouched down beside the hoof she lifted. She was right. There was still a small pocket of infection working its way out near the heel. Got any pine tar? He asked. Some. Mrs. Hale says we can't spend money on the vet. You don't need a vet for this. Just the tar, a clean rag, and about 4 more days of what you're already doing. He set the hoof down gently. She'll be fine. Naomi looked at him, that same direct, steady look. How do you know so much? About horses? About everything. Fences, hinges, horses. You don't work like a drifter. She tilted her head slightly. You work like a man who owns things and is trying to pretend he doesn't. The accuracy of that landed somewhere between his ribs. I've worked a lot of different places, he said. She didn't believe him. He could see it clearly. But she let it go, which told him more about her than if she'd pressed. She moved to hang the rag on the post, and in the early light of the barn he noticed for the first time the scar along her right forearm. An old one, faded to white, long and straight. The kind you got from a farm accident rather than anything else, nothing dramatic about it. She caught him looking. Fence wire, she said briefly. I was 16. Still don't have the knack for fence wire, he said. That earned him something he hadn't gotten from her yet. Not quite a smile, something smaller than a smile, but real in a way that most smiles weren't. She picked up her bucket and walked out of the barn. On the 6th day, Colton overheard the conversation that changed the shape of everything. He'd gone to the side of the house to fix a loose shutter that banged in the wind, and the window above the kitchen was open. He hadn't planned to listen. He wasn't the type of man who crouched under windows and cataloged other people's private words. But when your hands are busy and voices are carrying clearly through old sash windows that don't seal properly, stopping to hear is nearly involuntary. Margaret Hale's voice, tired, strung tight as old wire. Gannon will be here in 2 weeks. I've run the numbers 3 different ways, and there's no way around it. Delia, how much? More than we have. More than we could raise by selling half the herd, and if we sell the herd, we lose the ranch anyway. A long pause. Delia, what does he want? Besides the money. The silence that followed was different from the pause before it. Heavier. He made a suggestion, Margaret said carefully. At the last meeting, he said there might be another arrangement. Cora's voice softer. What kind of arrangement? He's a widower, Margaret said. 3 times over, which is its own story, but her voice shifted. Not unkind. More the sound of someone who had separated themselves from a decision by calling it practical. He said Naomi was a hard worker. He noticed it when he came last fall. Silence. She's not going to agree to that, Delia said. Not with any particular concern, more the tone of logistical skepticism. She doesn't have to agree to it, Margaret said. She has no rights to this property. She has nowhere else to go. And Gannon has made it very clear that this is the only alternative he's offering. Another silence. What if she runs? Cora asked. Where? Margaret said. And the word was flat and certain in the way that truth sometimes sounds when someone says it without feeling. Where would she go? Colton set down his tools very carefully. He stood with his back against the wall of the house for a moment, staring at the open ground in front of him, and felt something cold and deliberate settle into his chest. He had come here to observe, to understand who these people were. That was all he'd intended. He hadn't intended this. That evening after supper, a supper Naomi had cooked and then eaten standing in the kitchen while the others sat at the table, he found her at the edge of the property, on a low flat rock near the dry creek bed, sitting with her knees up and her eyes on the darkening sky. He walked out there and stopped a few feet away. Mind company? She looked at him. Something in her face was different from the usual careful blankness. Something that had been held for a long time was pressing closer to the surface. Sit if you want, she said. He sat on the ground near the rock, not crowding her. For a few minutes, neither of them said anything. That was all right. He'd always been comfortable in silence. You ever think about leaving? He asked, casual, not pressing. Every day, she said. So flat, so matter-of-fact that it stopped him. What keeps you? She was quiet for a moment. It was my father's ranch, she said. Before it was anything else, it was his. He built it. A pause. I kept thinking if I stayed and worked hard enough, it would still be his place, still have something of him in it. She stopped. That's probably stupid. No, he said. It's not. It's going to be sold anyway, she said. And then, almost to herself, or traded. He looked at her. She was looking at the sky. Traded for what? He asked. She didn't answer that. But the way her jaw tightened in the dusk, the same way it had tightened at the well on the first morning, the same way it tightened whenever Delia called out from the porch, told him that she already knew, that she had already heard something, or felt something coming, or simply knew this household well enough to have seen it on the horizon the way experienced ranchers saw weather. He stayed beside her while the last of the light went out of the sky, and he didn't tell her what he'd overheard, and he didn't tell her who he actually was, and he sat with the weight of both of those things like a man holding stones in each hand, trying to figure out which one had to be set down first. On the 8th morning, a rider arrived. He came in from the east, well-dressed on a dark bay horse, and he rode with the particular ease of a man who had never once worried about whether someone was watching him. He was older. Colton put him at somewhere past 60, a broad-shouldered man running to heaviness now, with a white mustache that he'd grown with care. His eyes moved over the property the way a buyer's eyes move over a property, tallying and assessing. He didn't dismount immediately when he arrived. He sat there and looked at the house, the barn, the corrals, with a small, satisfied expression, and then he swung down from the saddle and handed his reins to Colton without looking at him directly, the way men hand things to people they've decided are furniture. "Where's Mrs. Hale?" he asked. "In the house," Colton said. The man looked at him then, briefly. "You're new." "Yes, sir." The man's eyes moved on without interest, and he walked toward the house. That was Horace Gannon. Colton stood holding the man's horse and watched him knock on the door of Ashwood Ranch and be admitted with the warmth that people reserved for creditors they were afraid of. And he thought about the conversation he'd heard through the kitchen window, and he thought about Naomi Hale sitting on that rock in the gathering dark, saying every day in that flat, honest voice. He thought about a great many things. He tied the horse and went back to work. Gannon stayed for the afternoon. Colton found reasons to stay near the house. He moved from task to invented task, always within range of a door or a window that was open. He heard Margaret's voice, apologetic, conciliating, stretched. He heard Gannon's voice, patient, deliberate, certain, the voice of a man who was accustomed to waiting because he knew the outcome. The voice of a man for whom waiting was a tactic rather than a hardship. He didn't hear Naomi's voice from inside the house because Naomi wasn't in the house. She was in the vegetable garden at the back of the property, weeding, alone. When Colton came around the corner, she was pulling up bindweed with the focused determination of someone who needed to pull up something. "You know he's here," he said. She didn't stop working. "I know. Do you know why he's here?" She pulled up a long root and threw it into the pile. "I know why he's here." Colton crouched down at the edge of the garden. "Naomi." She stopped then. She sat back on her heels and looked at him, and her face had that quality again, pressed, contained, something working against the surface of it. "What do you want me to say?" she asked. "That I'm scared?" "I'm scared." She said it completely directly, not as admission of weakness, but as statement of fact. "I've been scared for 2 years since my father died, and I realized that there was nothing in that house. Not a document, not a word spoken aloud, not a single promise made in front of a witness that said I was anything other than a servant who happened to share a name with the family." She went back to weeding. "Being scared doesn't change it." "What would change it?" She pulled up another root. "Having somewhere else to go," she said. "Which I don't." He stayed there crouching at the edge of the garden for a moment, thinking. He had come here to observe. He had made that agreement with himself. Careful, quiet, no promises, just watching. He had understood that deception had limits, and that entering a household under false pretenses was already a complicated moral territory he was navigating with imperfect tools. But there was a man in that house right now, and Colton knew what that man was proposing, and the woman kneeling in the dirt in front of him had just said, "I'm scared," with the same plain honesty she brought to everything else. And he was sitting here with a ranch large enough to absorb Ashwood's debt 3 times over, and he was still pretending to be a drifter named Eli Cross. "You've got somewhere to go," he said. She stopped weeding again. She looked at him. "I don't know you," she said. Careful, not unkind. "I've known you 8 days." "I know." 8 days is not somewhere to go." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He looked at her steadily. "But I'm asking you to trust that there is a place, and that it's real, and that I'll explain everything, fully, honestly, the moment we're off this property." She stared at him. Her hands were dirty from the weeding. There were lines around her eyes that shouldn't be there on a 26-year-old woman. She looked at him with the look of someone who had been offered things before that turned out not to be what they appeared, and who had learned to measure the distance between a promise and the truth. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do that? You don't know me either." "I know enough," he said. 8 days of watching a person work is more revealing than 8 months of sitting at a dinner table with them. She was quiet for a long moment. From the house, through the walls, came the low murmur of Gannon's voice. Naomi looked down at her dirty hands and then up at the sky and then at him, and she didn't say yes or no. She said, "I need to think." "That's fair," he said. He stood up. "But I'd think fast." He walked back toward the barn, and he didn't look back, and behind him he could hear the steady pull of bindweed from dry ground, methodical, deliberate, practical. And he wasn't entirely sure whether that sound made him feel better or worse about the situation he had just walked into with both eyes open. She thought about it for 2 days. Colton knew she was thinking about it because she stopped talking to him. Not coldly, not with hostility, but with the focused absence of a person who is working through something and doesn't have the spare attention for conversation. She still handed him tools when they worked near each other. She still gave him a brief nod in the morning. But the small, honest exchanges they'd settled into over the first week went quiet, and he let them go quiet, because pushing her would be the worst thing he could do. He spent those 2 days watching Gannon. The land baron didn't stay at the ranch. He had a room at the hotel in Sulphur Creek, but he came back the following afternoon with a man who carried a leather satchel and walked behind Gannon the way certain kinds of men walk behind powerful men, slightly bent at the shoulders, eyes busy. A lawyer, or something close to it. They sat in the main room of the house for 2 hours while Naomi stayed outside, and Colton found work near enough to the window to observe the shape of things without hearing specifics. What he could observe was enough. Margaret Hale came out afterward with a bright, brittle expression that he recognized from other places and other faces. The expression of someone who has agreed to something they will not call by its right name because naming it would make it real. She went looking for Naomi. Colton put down what he was doing and moved closer, keeping himself near the barn wall with something useful in his hands. "There's something we need to discuss," Margaret said, finding Naomi at the woodpile. "Come inside." "I've still got half a cord to split," Naomi said. "Leave it. This is more important." Naomi set down the axe. She didn't look at Colton as she followed her stepmother inside. She didn't look at anything in particular. Her face had gone to that careful blankness, which meant he was starting to understand that she already knew what the conversation was going to be and was building her walls before she walked through the door. He stood there by the barn for a while after they went in. Then he went to the bunkhouse, sat on the edge of his cot, and looked at the wall for several minutes. He had a decision to make about exactly how honest to be and exactly how much longer he could maintain the shape of Eli Cross without the whole construction becoming something he wasn't going to be able to live with. The problem was that honesty carried its own complications. If he told Naomi who he was now, a wealthy rancher who had arrived in disguise to evaluate women for marriage, she had every right to be furious. He'd watched her for 9 days. He knew things about her life that she hadn't told him, had overheard conversations she'd never meant for him to hear. The deception, however well-intentioned, was a real thing that had real weight. And there was no version of coming clean that wasn't also asking her to absorb a significant piece of uncomfortable information about a man she'd been trusting. And yet the alternative was staying quiet while Horace Gannon came back with his leather satchel and his bent-shouldered lawyer and reduced her life to a line item in someone else's accounting. He was not going to do that. The question was only how to do it right. Naomi came out of the house an hour later. She walked straight to the woodpile, picked up the axe, and began splitting wood with a focused, controlled violence that said more than any words she might have chosen. Each split was clean and deliberate. She was not sloppy about it even now. That was the thing about her. She was never sloppy, never let the feeling overtake the function. And watching her maintain that discipline even now made something in his chest go complicated. He walked over and picked up a piece of wood, set it on the block, and held it steady. She stopped mid-swing. "What are you doing?" "Helping." "I don't need help with wood splitting." "I know you don't. I'm doing it anyway." She looked at him for a moment, then she split the piece he was holding, and he set up another one. They worked through the pile without speaking, the axe rising and falling in a rhythm, the wood splitting clean in the cold afternoon air. When the pile was done, she set the axe against the block and sat down on the splitting stump. He sat on the ground nearby, back against the fence, the way he'd sat by the rock at the creek that first evening. "He wants to marry me," she said, not asking for confirmation, just saying it plainly. "I know." She looked at him sharply. "How?" "Overheard something through the kitchen window, 6 days ago." He didn't dress it up. "I wasn't eavesdropping on purpose, but I heard it." Her jaw tightened. "And you didn't say anything." "I was waiting for the right moment, and I wanted to be sure I understood what I'd heard before I said something that might make things worse." She was quiet. He could see her deciding whether to be angry at him, weighing it against the practicality of whether anger would help, finding that it wouldn't and setting it aside. That was so entirely characteristic of her that it made his chest ache a little. "He's 63, she said. "He's been married 3 times. His last wife died of something that the doctor in town said he couldn't quite diagnose." She said it flatly, without drama. "Mrs. Hale says he's respectable. She says this is a good arrangement. She says I should be grateful." He didn't say anything. "She told me I have 2 weeks to get used to the idea." Naomi looked down at her hands, which were marked from the wood and the fence wire and a decade of other work. As if 2 weeks of getting used to it changes what it is. "Does she know?" he asked carefully. "About his previous wives?" "She knows enough." A pause. "She's decided it's not her problem." The flatness in her voice when she said that. Not bitterness, not even anger, just the absolute factual acceptance of the kind of cruelty that doesn't announce itself as cruelty, settled over the afternoon like weather. "I told you I'd explain things," he said. "The other day in the garden. I said I'd explain everything honestly." She looked at him. "Yes." "I'm going to do that, but I want to do it properly, not standing in a yard where anyone can hear. Can you meet me at the barn tomorrow morning before the house is up?" She studied him for a long moment. "You said 8 days of watching someone work tells you more than 8 months at a dinner table." "I meant it." "Then you already know whether I'm going to show up," she said, and she stood, brushed splinters from her skirt, and walked back toward the house. She was at the barn at first light. He was already there. He'd been there since before first light, which he hadn't planned but which happened anyway because he'd slept badly, which was also unusual for him. He was not generally a man who lost sleep. He ran a large operation, made consequential decisions regularly, had managed loss and drought, and 2 years of grief without losing more than an occasional night. But this particular situation had apparently found whatever soft spot remained underneath all of that. She came in out of the early gray and stood in the barn entrance looking at him. She was wearing her work clothes. Her hair was already pulled back. She looked like a woman who had also not slept particularly well and had decided to be functional about it. "All right," she said. "Explain." He told her. He told her his real name first, and he watched her face. She went very still when he said it, not shocked exactly, more like a woman who has suspected something and is now having the suspicion confirmed with a detail she hadn't anticipated. Colton Mercer, she repeated slowly. Yes. Mercer Ridge Ranch. Yes. She turned that over. He could see her doing it. That's... She stopped. That's 2 days' ride east. About that, it's a significant property. It wasn't a question. He heard in it that she knew the name. Most people in the territory knew the name, and she was rearranging the last 11 days in the light of this new information. It is, he said. I came here intentionally. I was told there were families in the area with daughters of marriageable age. I came ahead of any formal introduction to see what things actually looked like before anyone knew to put on a performance for me. Her eyes went careful. You were looking at Delia, or Cora. I was open to meeting whoever was here. He kept his voice even. I was not expecting what I found. Which was what, exactly? You, he said. And the situation you're in. She was quiet for a moment. A horse shifted in the nearest stall. Outside, the sky was going from gray to pale blue. So you watched me for 11 days, she said, learning things about me, and I didn't know who you were. Her tone wasn't accusatory yet, but it was working its way towards something. Yes, that's exactly what happened, and I'm not going to explain it away. It was a deception. I had reasons for it that seemed sound when I started, and they may or may not seem sound to you now. What were the reasons? He told her that too. Clara, the 6 years, the women who had asked about his water rights, the mothers with their careful letters, the 2 previous trips that had ended in quiet retreats before anyone knew he'd been there. He told it plainly, without making himself sympathetic, because making himself sympathetic would have been its own kind of manipulation. She listened. He had noticed that about her. She was a genuine listener, not the kind of person who listened while also composing their response. She actually heard things. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. So the plan was to find a woman who'd treat a drifter decently, she said, and you'd consider that evidence of good character. Something like that. And I treated you decently. You did. I treat everyone decently, she said, with a slight edge. I treat Gannon's horse decently. That's not... I wasn't performing for you. I didn't know you were watching. I know, he said. That's exactly why it meant something. She turned away from him, walked to the mare's stall, the gray with the healing hoof, and put her hand on the horse's neck. The horse turned and pushed against her palm. She stood like that for a moment, facing away from him. What is it you're proposing? She asked. Her voice was controlled, but it was a careful control, the kind that required effort. That you leave here with me, he said, before Gannon comes back. That you come to Mercer Ridge, and that I give you time and space and no pressure, and that we figure out from there what is and isn't possible between 2 people who are starting from an honest place. A pause. I'm not proposing marriage. I'm proposing a way out of something that is not right and that you don't deserve. She turned around. And what do I give you in return? She asked. For this generosity. Nothing. There's no transaction. I'm not Gannon. She flinched slightly at that, and he thought he'd overstepped, but then she nodded once, slowly. I know you're not. I know I'm asking you to trust someone you've known for 11 days, he said. I know that what I've just told you about myself is a reason not to trust me as much as a reason to. You're allowed to say no. You're allowed to think I'm exactly what I look like. A wealthy man who thought he could arrange things to his advantage and is now in over his head. That last part surprised her. He saw it in her face. Are you in over your head? Somewhat, he admitted. I didn't plan on actually caring what happened to you. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face was doing what the mare did when she let you touch the sore leg. Still but trusting, making a decision not to flinch. I need another day, she said. You have it. She went back to the mare and continued what she'd started, and he left her there with the horse in the growing morning and walked out into the early light with the particular feeling of a man who has laid down something heavy and does not yet know if it was the right thing to do. Mab, What happened next was not the crisis he'd been watching for. It was something smaller and uglier, which in his experience was often how the real crisis announced itself. It was the afternoon of that same day, and Naomi was in the kitchen, and Delia came in wanting something reheated that had gone cold while she'd been doing nothing for 2 hours. And Naomi said she'd get to it, and Delia said no, now. And Naomi said, with the quiet steadiness of someone who has swallowed the same argument approximately 400 times, that she had bread in the oven, and if she left it now, it would burn. And Delia reached past her and knocked the bread pan off the counter onto the floor. It hit the floor with a flat, hard sound. The silence after it was complete. Naomi stood looking at the ruined bread on the floor. The dough had come out of the pan. It was salvageable, partially, if you were the kind of person who could look at salvageable and see it for what it was rather than what it wasn't. Delia said, "Now you don't have to worry about the bread," and she walked out. Naomi crouched down and began collecting the dough. Colton was in the doorway. He'd come around the back of the house because he'd heard the sound, not the argument, just the hard, flat sound of the pan hitting the floor. And now he stood in the kitchen doorway watching her pick dough off the floor with the same systematic care she brought to picking debris out of a horse's hoof. "Leave it," he said quietly. "I can save some of it." "Naomi." She stopped. She was crouched on the kitchen floor with a piece of dough in each hand, and she stopped and looked up at him. And for the first time in 12 days, the careful blankness wasn't there. What was there instead was the thing that lived underneath it. Not devastation, not collapse, nothing so dramatic. Just a very profound, quiet, old tiredness that had been there a long time and had run out of places to hide. She set the dough down. She stood up. She went to the basin and washed her hands. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "before anyone's up." He nodded. She dried her hands and went to make Delia's reheated meal, because that was who she was, and watching her do it was one of the hardest things he'd witnessed in a long time. He spent the rest of that afternoon doing something he should have done earlier. He rode into Sulphur Creek and stopped at the telegraph office. He sent 2 messages. The first was to his foreman at Mercer Ridge, a steady man named Aldous Webb, telling him to expect additional people in the next week and to prepare the south room in the house. He kept it brief and used the language he and Aldous had developed over the years for situations that required discretion. The second message was to his lawyer in Tucson, a man named Delaney Morse, who had sharp eyes and a sharper memory, asking him to look into Horace Gannon's property dealings in the last 3 years, and particularly any agreements signed under financial duress. He didn't explain why. Morse was used to not being explained to in full and working well anyway. He rode back to Ashwood in the early evening and went about the last tasks of the day as Eli Cross, and nobody in that household looked at him twice. He did not sleep at all that night. This was not from anxiety exactly. It was the particular wakefulness of a man who is committed to a course of action and is now lying in the dark, running through every possible way it could go wrong. He was good at that. It was, Clara had once told him, his least attractive quality, this compulsive inventory of worst cases. She'd said it with affection. He'd argued that it was actually useful. She'd said that most useful things were also unpleasant, and that didn't make them attractive. He thought about her, lying there on the narrow bunkhouse cot, not with the raw grief that had defined the first year or the dull ache that had been the second, more just with the feeling of someone who is looked at directly for a moment before the moment passes. Then he thought about a woman who'd knocked a bread pan off a counter and walked out of a room. Then he thought about what he was going to say to Margaret Hale in the morning, which was the part he was least certain about. Naomi was at the barn at 4 a.m, exactly as she'd said. She had a bag, not large, just a canvas saddlebag with both straps buckled tight, the bag of a person who had packed quickly but efficiently, taking only what was genuinely necessary. She was already saddled on a brown quarter horse that Colton knew was hers. Boyd's gift to her years ago, one of the few things in this household that was actually hers without question. He had his own horse ready. He had his bedroll, his coat, and the things he'd brought in the first place, which were minimal because he'd packed for a drifter. She looked at him in the dark barn, the horses shifting quietly around them. "If we leave now," she said, "there's going to be trouble." "Yes." "They'll say you took me." "They might." "Will that be a problem for you?" He considered that seriously rather than dismissing it. It might complicate things in the short term, he said. It won't be a lasting problem. I know people in this territory, and I know the law, and the law will not side with a man trying to force a woman into a debt marriage she didn't agree to. She nodded slowly. She patted her horse's neck once, not nervous, just the touch of a person and an animal that know each other well. My father built this barn, she said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the rafters. He put those beams up himself. Took him 2 weeks. Colton waited. I'm ready, she said. They rode out before dawn, walking the horses until they were past the gate, and the sound of hooves on dirt wouldn't carry back to the house. The sky in the east had just begun its first gray suggestions of morning. The air was cold enough to see their breath. They rode for an hour in near silence. Not uncomfortable silence. The silence of two people who have each decided to move forward and are spending the energy on the moving rather than the talking. When they'd put enough distance between themselves and Ashwood Ranch, when the property was behind a long ridge and out of sight, Naomi let out a breath that he heard clearly in the still morning air. It was a long breath. It had been held for some time. She didn't say anything. She just rode, and he rode beside her, and the sky kept going lighter around them, and somewhere in the distance a hawk called out once and then went quiet. They stopped at midday to rest the horses by a small spring he knew from previous rides through the territory. She filled the canteens while he loosened the cinches on the saddles, and then they sat on opposite sides of a flat rock and ate. She'd brought biscuits in her bag, wrapped in a cloth, and they were from the batch she'd made the morning before, not the ruined bread, and they were good. What is Mercer Ridge like? She asked. He thought about how to answer that honestly. Big, he said first. That's the first thing. It takes a while to stop feeling large. About 3,000 acres, though we don't run cattle on all of it. We've got good water, which is rare, and we've managed it carefully. He paused. It's not fancy. The house is solid, and there are people working there who know what they're doing, but it's a working ranch, it's not something a person puts on display. Things break, and we fix them, and they break again. She was listening the way she listened, actually taking it in. How many people work there? She asked. 22 hands regular. We take on seasonal help. There's a woman named Rosa who runs the house, kitchen, domestic, and she has 2 girls who help her. And Aldous, my foreman. He's been with me since I inherited the place. You inherited it? From my father, but it was a smaller property then. I've spent the last 10 years building it up. He stopped himself there because he was aware that cataloging his own assets was not the kind of thing that served any purpose here. She seemed to recognize that too, because what she asked next had nothing to do with the size of anything. What was your wife like? He hadn't expected that question. He sat with it for a moment. Impatient, he said finally. She had no tolerance for people who wouldn't say what they meant. She could tell within 5 minutes of meeting someone whether they were worth her time, and she was almost always right, which was irritating. He looked at the middle distance. She was funny. Not in a performance way, just things struck her as absurd and she'd say so. She was a better judge of horses than anyone I've ever known, including people who spent their whole lives working with horses. He paused. She was sick for a long time before she died. She handled it better than I handled her handling it. Naomi was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, she said. Not the reflexive kind of sorry people produce to fill a silence, the actual kind. Thank you, he said. They ate their biscuits, and the horses cropped at the sparse grass near the spring, and the afternoon moved around them, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And that was all right, too. By late afternoon, when the light had gone slant and golden across the scrubland, Naomi asked the question he'd been waiting for. What do you actually want from this? She said. Not the version you told me to get me to leave, the real version. He appreciated the directness enough to meet it straight. I want to know if the person I've spent 12 days watching is the same person when the pressure is off, he said. Whether the qualities I saw at Ashwood are who you actually are, or whether they were what that situation made you. She thought about that. And if they're just who I am when I'm being ground down, Then I still think you're worth knowing, he said. But I think they're who you are. I think the situation at Ashwood was trying to make you into something smaller than you are and not quite succeeding. She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes on the horizon. I don't know what I'm worth when I'm not carrying something, she said. I've been carrying something since I was 12 years old. I don't know what I look like without it. That, he said carefully, seems worth finding out. She turned and looked at him then, and he looked back. And between them was 12 days of real observation and one morning of genuine honesty and a long road still ahead. And none of it was settled, and none of it was easy, and none of it was anything like the clean arranged transactions that well-meaning people had been proposing to him for 2 years. It was considerably more complicated than that, and considerably more real. And as the horses moved forward into the long Arizona evening, Colton Mercer found that complicated and real was, in the end, exactly what he'd been looking for. They arrived at Mercer Ridge Ranch in the early evening of the second day, when the sky had gone deep orange at the edges and the first stars were just beginning to show themselves above the eastern hills. Naomi didn't say anything when she first saw it. She just looked. He watched her take it in. The long fence line running straight to the horizon, the substantial barn with its fresh painted siding, the main house set back from the road with its wide porch and the yellow light coming from the windows. Working pens to the left, a bunkhouse beyond the barn, the sound of cattle somewhere in the middle distance, and the smell of wood smoke from the cookhouse. She took all of it in with the steady, assessing eye of someone who understood what they were looking at. You said it wasn't fancy, she said. It isn't. It's considerably more than not fancy. It's functional, he said. Everything you're looking at serves a purpose. She was quiet for another moment. It's big, she said, which was what he'd told her and which was clearly landing differently now that she was looking at it. It takes some getting used to, he said. Took me years to stop feeling like a guest here. She looked at him sideways. Do you feel like a guest now? No, he said. Now it just feels like what it is. He nudged his horse forward. Come on. Aldous will be wanting to give me an earful about what's been going undone while I was gone, and Rosa will want to feed you. Oops. Rosa Vargas was a compact woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and a way of assessing a newcomer in the space of 3 seconds that would have made a poker player nervous. She came out onto the porch when they rode in, wiping her hands on her apron, and she looked at Colton first and then at Naomi and then back at Colton, and her expression said a number of things that her mouth did not. Rosa, Colton said, dismounting, this is Naomi Hale. She'll be staying in the south room for now. She's had a long 2 days and she could use supper and a place to wash up. Of course, Rosa said, and her voice was entirely neutral in the way of women who are saving their questions for later. She looked at Naomi. Come inside. I've got stew that's been on since noon. Naomi dismounted and handed her horse to the young hand who'd appeared from the barn. She looked at the horse once, that single backward look of a person making sure the animal is in good hands, and then she followed Rosa into the house. Aldous Webb appeared from the direction of the pens before Colton had finished unsaddling his own horse. He was a tall, lean man of 50 with a sun-seamed face and eyes that could read weather at 4 miles. He took in Colton's worn clothes and 2-day road dust with the expression of a man who is not going to say what he is thinking. Good trip? Aldous said. Complicated one. I got your wire. A pause. South room's ready. Thank you. Gee, trouble? Aldous asked, not unkindly. Just logistics. No, Colton said. She's not trouble. She's in a bad situation that we've helped her out of, and she needs somewhere solid to stand while she figures out what comes next. He looked at his foreman. Treat her like she belongs here. Aldous looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he nodded once. Anything else I should know? There may be people coming here looking for her. Within the week, probably sooner. I'll tell you more when I know more. He handed over his horse. What's burned down while I was gone? Nothing burned. North pasture fence went down in 3 places. Martinez's boy broke his wrist on Tuesday. He'll be out 3 weeks. And someone's been moving the boundary markers on the east property line again. Graydon? Almost certainly. Colton rubbed the back of his neck. All right, We'll deal with it. In the morning. He went inside. He found Naomi in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a bowl of stew in front of her, and Rosa moving around the stove behind her. She'd washed her face and hands. She was sitting with her back straight and both hands around the bowl, and she was eating. Not quickly, not with the hunched efficiency of someone eating in a hurry before being called back to work, but with the careful, slightly cautious manner of a person who isn't entirely sure they're allowed to eat at this table. He sat down across from her. Rosa set another bowl in front of him without being asked, and went back to the stove. "All right?" he asked. "Yes," Naomi said. And then, more honestly, "I don't know." "That's fair. It's a lot to take in." "I know." She looked around the kitchen, at the hanging copper pots, the long table, the window with the dark settling outside it. "How many people eat in this kitchen?" "Varies. Aldous most evenings, Rosa and her girls. Sometimes a hand or two if they're helping with something in the house." He looked at her. "It's not a formal household. Nobody stands on ceremony here." She nodded slowly, processing that. Rosa said, without turning from the stove, "The bread is from this morning, Naomi. Help yourself." Something small and involuntary crossed Naomi's face at that. At being addressed by name, at being offered bread without having been asked to fetch it or make it first. She reached for a piece. Colton watched all of this and kept his face quiet. 3 days passed. He gave her space, which was not entirely easy because he was a man accustomed to forward motion, and Mercer Ridge Ranch offered him no shortage of things that needed his attention and that he'd been away from for 2 weeks. He worked. He walked the fence line that had come down and directed the repair. He had a long conversation with Aldous about the boundary markers and sent a careful letter to his lawyer about Graydon's encroachment. He checked on Martinez's boy in the bunkhouse, who was 17 and embarrassed about his wrist and needed someone to tell him it happened to everyone and wasn't a comment on his usefulness. He did not make himself constantly available to Naomi, but he also did not pretend she wasn't there. What he noticed over those 3 days was that she moved into the work of the ranch the way water moves into ground, gradually, naturally, without announcement. He came back from the north fence on the second afternoon and found her and Rosa in the kitchen garden, and they were talking. Not deeply, just the ordinary talk of 2 women doing a practical task, and Naomi was pulling weeds with the same methodical efficiency she'd brought to everything at Ashwood, and Rosa was watching her hands with the expression of a woman who recognizes quality work. On the 3rd morning, he found her in the barn before breakfast, cleaning the gray mare's hoof. Not his gray mare, not a horse she had any particular claim on, just an animal that needed attention and that she had noticed needed attention and was addressing. "She picked something up?" he asked from the doorway. "Small stone, lodged in the heel, same side as your other mare had it." She set the hoof down and straightened. "It's clean now. She'll be fine." He looked at her. "You don't have to work here, Naomi. I know. You're not paying room and board through labor. That's not the arrangement." "I know that too." She picked up the hoof pick and cleaned it off. "I work because I don't know what to do with myself when I'm not working. That's probably something I'll have to address at some point." She said it with a slight dryness that he'd started to hear more of in the last 3 days. A small thread of wry humor that the Ashwood household had apparently not been able to extinguish entirely. "Address it on your own schedule," he said. She almost smiled. "Right, but that..." The wire came on the 4th morning. It was from Delaney Morse in Tucson, and it arrived just after breakfast, and Colton read it at the kitchen table while Rosa and Naomi were doing dishes. He read it twice, then folded it and held it in his hand for a moment. "What is it?" Naomi asked. She had her back to him at the basin, but she'd evidently heard the particular silence of a person reading bad news. "From my lawyer," he said. "About Gannon." She turned around, drying her hands on a cloth. Rosa went very still at the stove. "He's looked into Gannon's history," Colton said. "The last 3 properties he acquired under debt agreements. 2 of them were acquired under conditions that Morse says a good territorial judge would look hard at. Men who owed Gannon money and found themselves owing significantly more than they'd originally borrowed, with interest terms that weren't in the original agreements." He paused. He also found two women who signed marriage contracts under conditions that the lawyer's word for is duress, though he says proving it is another matter. Naomi stood with the dishcloth in her hands and said nothing. His third wife didn't die of something the doctor couldn't diagnose, Colton said. She died of a fall down a staircase. The inquest said accident. He stopped there. The kitchen was very quiet. Morse says he's not a man to cross, Colton said. He has money, and he has people, and he has the kind of long-standing relationships with certain officials that make legal action complicated. He looked at Naomi. He's also going to come here. You know that. I know, she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands had tightened on the dishcloth. When? I don't know exactly, but he had 2 weeks before his arrangement with the Hales was finalized, and we've used 4 days of that. Rosa said quietly. He can't take her from here. No, Colton said. He can't, but he can make things complicated, and I want to be prepared. He looked at Naomi. I want you to know what's coming, and I want you to know that I'm not going to let it be your problem to face alone. She looked at him, that steady, direct look, and something in it was different now than it had been at Ashwood. At Ashwood, her steadiness had been about containment, about holding things in so there was nothing available to be taken from her. This was different. This was someone standing on ground that was at least temporarily solid and choosing to look straight ahead instead of down. Thank you, she said. Then, what did he say about the Hales? What does this do to their debt? Colton considered his next words. It doesn't resolve it. The debt is real regardless of how Gannon operates. Ashwood Ranch was genuinely in financial trouble. A pause. Morse says there may be grounds to renegotiate the terms if the original interest calculations were irregular, but that's a long process. Mrs. Hale doesn't know any of that, Naomi said quietly. About his wives. About the other properties. He wasn't sure that was entirely true, but he said, probably not all of it. She made a bad decision, Naomi said. About me. A very bad one. She folded the dishcloth and set it on the counter with characteristic neatness. But she's not a bad woman. She's a frightened one who made a bad decision. A pause. I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything with it right now, he said. No, she agreed. Right now there's enough else. On the morning of the 6th day, they came. Colton was at the far end of the east pasture, checking the repositioned boundary markers with Aldous, when one of the younger hands came riding hard from the direction of the main road. Company at the gate, the boy said, pulling up with more drama than the situation strictly required, but not so much more that Colton could fault him for it. 4 men. One of them's Gannon. He's got 2 that look like hired muscle and a man with papers. Aldous looked at Colton. You want me with you? Yes. Bring Martinez and tell him to bring Rodriguez. He looked at the young hand. Go to the house and tell Rosa to keep Naomi inside until I send word. Not because she has to. Just ask her to wait. He rode back toward the main house at a pace that was measured rather than hurried. There was a version of this situation that escalated because of the way a man arrived at it, and he did not want that version. Gannon was at the gate. He was on his dark bay horse, sitting with the same comfortable authority he'd had at Ashwood, and behind him were 3 men, 2 with the particular kind of stillness that meant they were paid to be present and prepared for whatever present required, and one who was already holding the leather satchel that contained his papers, the bent-shouldered lawyer. Colton rode up to the gate from the inside and stopped. Gannon, he said. Gannon looked at him with the measuring expression of a man revising a situation. He'd known he was coming to Mercer Ridge Ranch, had known in the abstract who Colton Mercer was. But the knowing and the arriving were different things, and Gannon was clearly doing the rapid recalculation that Colton had watched other men do when they showed up expecting Eli Cross and found the gate of a 3,000-acre operation. Mercer, Gannon said. His voice was courteous, careful, not backing down but not leading forward either. I understand you have a young woman here who left Ashwood Ranch without the family's consent. Naomi Hale is 26 years old, Colton said. She doesn't require family consent to go anywhere. She's a dependent of Margaret Hale's household. She's a grown woman who left a property where she had no legal standing and no contractual obligation to remain. He kept his voice even. He'd learned years ago that calm in a confrontation cost the other person more than any display of anger could. She's a guest at Mercer Ridge, that's all. Gannon's jaw tightened, just slightly. There's an agreement between you and Margaret Hale, Colton said. Naomi Hale was not a party to that agreement. She didn't sign it. She wasn't consulted about it. A person cannot be pledged as security against a debt without their knowledge or consent. That is true in this territory and every other territory I'm aware of. She has an obligation. What obligation? Colton said. Name it. Give me the legal basis for it. He looked at the man with the satchel. You're a lawyer, presumably. What's the legal instrument here? What is the document that gives Gannon a claim on Naomi Hale's person? The lawyer opened his mouth and then closed it again. He looked at Gannon. She owes the Hale family, Gannon started. She owes them nothing, Colton said. She worked that ranch for 14 years without wages, without compensation of any kind. She was excluded from her own father's estate. He let that settle for a moment. If anyone owes anyone anything in that household, the arithmetic runs in the opposite direction. Gannon's face had changed during this exchange. The careful courtesy was gone now, and what was underneath it was harder and less polished and considerably more honest. His eyes had gone flat in the way eyes go flat when a man has decided to stop performing civility and start applying pressure. You've made an enemy today, he said. Quiet, certain. I've made enemies before, Colton said. I've generally survived them. I have arrangements in this county, Gannon said. With the sheriff, with the land office. I know about your arrangements, Colton said. My lawyer is in Tucson, and he's been looking at your arrangements for the last 4 days. He watched Gannon's face. He's found some interesting things. About interest calculations on debt agreements that don't match the original terms. About properties acquired under conditions that a territorial judge might want to examine. A pause. About a staircase in Maricopa County. The silence that followed that was a different kind of silence. Gannon sat very still on his horse. Behind him, the 2 men who'd been paid to stand ready were no longer looking bored. The lawyer had gone slightly pale. That's a serious accusation, Gannon said. His voice had changed again, quieter, more compressed, the voice of a man exerting control over something that wants to move faster. I haven't accused you of anything, Colton said. I've told you what my lawyer found while looking into your business history. What a territorial judge would make of it is his matter, not mine. He leaned forward slightly on his horse, the smallest adjustment of posture that nonetheless changed the quality of what he was saying. I'm a straightforward man, Gannon. I'm not interested in making your life difficult unless you give me a clear reason to. But I will tell you plainly, Naomi Hale is not going anywhere she doesn't choose to go, and the next conversation I have with Delaney Morse will depend almost entirely on what you decide to do in the next 30 seconds. It was quiet. Somewhere on the ranch, a horse whinnied at nothing in particular. A crow called twice from the cottonwood near the barn and then went silent. Gannon looked at him for a long time. It was the look of a man running calculations. What he had, what he could press, what the risk was of pressing it, what it would cost to press it against a man who had just demonstrated both preparation and composure. Gannon was not a stupid man. He had built a significant operation on the ability to identify which opponents could be overcome and which ones would cost more than the prize was worth. This isn't finished, Gannon said finally. I expect not, Colton said. But today it's finished. He held the man's gaze. Ride back to town, Gannon. Another long moment, then Gannon turned his horse. The lawyer and the 2 hired men turned with him, and they rode back down the main road toward the gate, and Colton sat still and watched them go until they were out of sight around the first bend. Aldous pulled up beside him. That's not a man who leaves things, he said. No, Colton agreed. It isn't. He turned his horse toward the house. Tell Rodriguez to keep an eye on the east perimeter tonight. Also, Naomi was on the porch when he came back. She'd evidently not stayed inside the way Rosa had asked, which surprised him for about 3 seconds, and then didn't. She was standing at the porch railing with her arms crossed, and she'd clearly watched at least some of what had happened at the gate from this distance. What did he say? She asked. He said it wasn't finished. Colton dismounted and handed his horse to the waiting hand. He's not wrong. This was one conversation, not a resolution. What comes next? Morse keeps working. We build a case against Gannon's practices, not just as they relate to you, but the broader pattern. He came up the steps. It won't be fast, and it may get uncomfortable before it gets better. She absorbed this. The staircase, she said. His third wife. Yes. He didn't deny it. No, Colton said. He didn't. She looked out toward the road where the riders had disappeared. Her jaw was tight, but her eyes were clear. She said he was respectable, she said. Mrs. Hale. The words had a quality to them. Not contempt exactly, more the sound of something being turned over and examined and found to be what it is rather than what someone claimed. She may genuinely not have known the extent of it, Colton said. People hear what they need to hear. She knew enough, Naomi said quietly. She just needed to not know enough to stay comfortable. She paused. That's a kind of choosing, even if it doesn't look like one. He said nothing. She was right, and adding to it wouldn't help. Colton. She turned and looked at him directly. His real name, not Eli, and he noticed her using it each time now, that small, consistent choice. What you said to him, about the interest calculations, the debt agreements, a pause. Can you actually do something about it? Or was that a bluff? He met her eyes. I don't bluff. I may not know the full outcome yet, but what I told him was true. Morse has found real irregularities. Whether they're enough to bring formal action depends on things we don't have yet, but it's not nothing. He looked at her steadily. And I intend to get the rest. She studied him. Why? She said. This is well beyond. You got me out of Ashwood. That was what you said you'd do. This is different. It's different, he agreed. Why? She asked again. He took a moment with that, not to construct an answer, but to find the real one. Because what Gannon does to one person, he does to the next one after that, he said. And the one after that. And if the people with the means to stop it decide it's somebody else's problem, once the immediate situation is resolved, then nothing changes. He paused. And because it's right. She looked at him for another moment. Then something in her face did what the wry thread of humor had been doing, something small and real surfacing through the careful surface. You are, she said slowly, a considerably more complicated man than I thought you were when you walked through Ashwood's gate in that shirt. That shirt was terrible, he admitted. It was very terrible. She almost smiled. And then she did. Just slightly. Just at the corner of her mouth. And it was the second time he'd seen it, and it was still the most unguarded thing about her face. He smiled back before he thought about it. That evening after supper, Colton sat at the desk in his study and wrote 3 letters. The first was to Delaney Morse, asking him to expand the inquiry to include all of Gannon's debt agreements in the last 5 years, and to identify any living parties who might be willing to speak to the irregularities. The second was to the territorial sheriff's office in Phoenix, not the local sheriff, whose arrangements with Gannon gave Colton legitimate concern about impartiality, laying out in careful language what his lawyer had found and requesting that a deputy be dispatched to interview several named individuals. The third was more difficult to write. He sat with it for a while before he started, and when he did start, he wrote slowly. It was to Margaret Hale. He did not write it with warmth. He had no warmth available for Margaret Hale at present, but he wrote it with honesty, which had the advantage of being something he could sustain regardless of what he felt. He told her what Morse had found about Gannon. He told her about the third wife and the staircase. He told her that the interest calculations on Ashwood's debt agreement should be examined by her own legal counsel, and that he knew of a man in Tucson, not Morse, another man, who did honest work and would not charge her more than she could afford. He did not tell her that Naomi was well, or settled, or adjusting. Those were Naomi's words, to give or not give. He sealed all 3 letters and left them for the morning rider. Then he sat in the quiet study for a while longer, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into night. The distant cattle, the horses in the barn, the creak of the house in the cooling air. He'd sat in this room after Clara died and found no comfort in it, He'd sat here on many evenings since and found something less than comfort, but more than nothing. The particular companionship of a place that knew you, that held the shape of your years. He thought about Naomi in the south room. He thought about what she'd said. I don't know what I look like without something to carry. He thought about what that would take and how long, and whether it was something you could help with from the outside or whether it was only and entirely an inside job. He thought that he probably wasn't going to sleep again tonight. He was right. Tick. 3 days later, Gannon moved. Not with hired men at the gate this time, with paperwork. A deputy arrived from the county seat, the local county, not Phoenix, not the territorial office, the county where Gannon's arrangements were well established, carrying a document that was presented as a writ of civil obligation. It claimed that Naomi Hale had departed Ashwood Ranch with personal property that belonged to the estate. It listed 1/4 horse, brown, branded with the Ashwood mark, 1 set of tools, 1 canvas saddlebag. The horse had been her father's gift to her. She had the letter he'd written when he gave it to her, folded and slightly worn, which she produced with the careful steadiness of a woman who has understood since childhood that you kept evidence. The tools she had bought herself, with money she'd earned doing piecework for a neighbor 2 summers ago, and she had the neighbor's signed receipt because the neighbor was an honest woman who had been friends with her father and had thought to write it down. The saddlebag had been hers since she was 19. Colton stood beside her in the front room as she laid each document on the table in front of the deputy, and he watched the deputy's face go from official impassivity to something more uncomfortable as the counter-evidence accumulated. The horse was a gift from her father, Colton said, prior to his death, documented. The deputy looked at the letter. The tools are her personal property, purchased by her own earnings. Colton kept his voice level. Documented. The deputy looked at the receipt. The bag has been hers for 7 years. He looked at the writ in the deputy's hand. What property exactly does this document claim she took? The deputy looked at the writ again. He had the expression of a man who had not expected the other side to show up prepared. I'll need to verify these with the claimant, he said. Take your time, Colton said. We'll wait. The deputy left with the documents and a particular stiffness in his bearing that suggested a difficult conversation was ahead of him. Colton wasn't certain the writ would be withdrawn. Gannon had influence in this county, and men with influence could keep paperwork moving through a system for quite a long time, regardless of its merits. But the deputy had seen enough to know that this wasn't a clean case, and men who weren't entirely corrupt tended to prefer not to be visibly on the wrong side of a clean documentation trail. When he was gone, Naomi set her father's letter down on the table and smoothed it once with 2 fingers. She looked at the letter for a moment. He gave me the horse the summer before he got sick, she said. He said every woman ought to have one thing that was unambiguously hers. She paused. I don't think he knew he was going to need to say it in writing. It was good that he did, Colton said quietly. Yes. She picked the letter up and refolded it along the worn creases. He was a good man, not perfect. He didn't fight hard enough for me when he married Margaret. He knew what it would be, and he told himself it would be better than it was. She held the letter. But he was a good man, and I miss him. She said it plainly, the way she said everything, not asking for comfort, not performing grief, just stating a true thing in the quiet room. He said, I know, because it was the only thing that was actually useful. She tucked the letter into her pocket. Outside, the evening was coming in across the open land, and somewhere on the property, Aldous was calling out something to one of the hands, and the ordinary sounds of the ranch moved around the house like water around a stone, steady and indifferent and reassuring in their steadiness. And Naomi stood in the fading light with her hand over her pocket and the letter inside it, and Colton stood near enough to be present and far enough away to let her have the moment that was hers. There was more coming, he knew that. Gannon didn't retreat, he regrouped, and whatever came next would be harder and more considered than a civil writ served by an uncertain deputy. The work with Morse was ongoing. The letter to Phoenix had not yet been answered. The situation had the quality of a storm you could see clearly on the horizon, formed, moving, real, but that had not yet reached you. He was not afraid of it. He'd been through harder things on this land, and he knew what he was capable of, and he knew the people around him, and he knew how to build a case the way you built a fence, post by post, wire by wire, no shortcuts, no gaps you'd have to come back to. What he hadn't counted on, standing in the quiet of that front room, was the particular weight of knowing that the storm was coming for someone else, and that the someone else was standing 3 feet away from him refolding a letter from her dead father. And that the weight of that was different from anything he'd carried in a long time, different in kind and in consequence, and that there was nothing useful he could do with it at the moment except stand there and hold it. He was getting fairly good at holding things. The answer from Phoenix came 9 days after Colton sent his letter. It arrived on a Tuesday morning while he was in the barn with Aldous going over the week's work schedule, and Rosa brought it out with the particular expression she wore when she knew something was in an envelope that mattered. He opened it standing in the barn doorway, read it twice, and handed it to Aldous without comment. Aldous read it. His eyebrows moved a quarter inch, which for Aldous was significant. "Deputy Marshal Hicks," Aldous said, reading the name. "Coming Thursday." "Coming Thursday," Colton confirmed. "Which means we have 2 days to make sure everything Morse has gathered is organized and accessible." He took the letter back. "And it means Gannon is likely to hear about it before Thursday. His people are in the county office," Aldous said. "His people are everywhere in this county, which is part of why I wrote to Phoenix instead of locally." He folded the letter. "Send word to Morse. Tell him to be here by Wednesday evening if he can manage it." Aldous nodded and went. Colton stood in the barn doorway a moment longer, looking at the morning. He'd managed larger things than this. He'd fought a water rights dispute that had lasted 2 years and cost him more money in legal fees than he wanted to recall. He'd dealt with cattle thieves and drought, and a foreman before Aldous who'd been skimming from the operation for 3 years before Colton caught it. He was not unfamiliar with the particular grinding work of a slow-moving conflict that required patience and documentation and the willingness to let things develop at their own rate while you built the thing you were building. But this felt different in ways he was still sorting out. He went to find Naomi. She was where she often was in the mornings now, in the kitchen garden, which had become a kind of headquarters for her in the 3 weeks since her arrival. Rosa had relinquished it to her with a casualness that Colton suspected was deliberate, the older woman recognizing that Naomi needed somewhere that was hers, and that a kitchen garden was a reasonable somewhere. She'd reorganized it already. Not dramatically. She hadn't torn anything out or started over. But she'd imposed a quiet order on what had been functioning but slightly chaotic, and the result was something that worked better than it had without looking like it had been dramatically altered. Colton had noticed this was how she operated in general. She improved things without making the improvement visible as an act of will. She looked up when he came through the gate, and she read his face before he said anything. "News?" she asked. He told her about the letter, about Deputy Marshal Hicks, about the timeline. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he'd genuinely come to rely on. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning a tomato plant steak in her hands. "Gannon will know by tomorrow," she said. "Probably. What will he do?" "I don't know exactly. He has options." He sat on the low wooden bench near the garden fence. He could try to move before Hicks arrives, some kind of legal action in the county court where his influence is strongest. Get something on paper that complicates the federal inquiry before it starts. He paused. He could try to apply pressure through other channels, business pressure, the kind that's difficult to trace directly back to him. Another pause. Or he could recognize that the situation has changed significantly from what he expected and begin considering his position. "Which do you think he'll do?" "Men like Gannon don't consider their position until they have to," he said. "So probably not that one. Not yet." She nodded. She set the steak down and looked at the garden for a moment. "The Hales will hear about it too," she said. "Yes." "They'll come here." Not a question. "I think so. The situation has changed for them too. If Gannon's debt arrangements are being examined, the terms of what they owe may change. They have reasons to be here that have nothing to do with you." He watched her face. "That's going to be a harder conversation than the one with Gannon." She looked at him directly. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about it." A pause. "I can't just... I'm angry at her," At Mrs. Hale. I think I've been angry at her for 2 years without letting myself call it that. She looked back at the garden. And I can still see that she was frightened and that she didn't know everything about Gannon and that she's probably genuinely believed for years that she was managing an impossible situation. She stopped. Both of those things are true at the same time, and I don't quite know how to hold them. You don't have to resolve it before she gets here, he said. You just have to decide what you're willing to say. And what I'm not willing to pretend. That too. She pulled a small weed from the base of the nearest plant, looked at it, dropped it. My father used to say that anger was just love that didn't know where to go anymore. She said it without sentimentality, just observing. I think that's probably too neat. But there might be something in it. He said nothing. He thought she was right that it was too neat, and also right that there was something in it, and that pointing out either of those things would not add to what she'd just said. She picked up her gloves from the bench and went back to work. He went to write to Morse. No. Morse arrived Wednesday evening, road-dusty and sharp-eyed, with a leather case thick enough that one of the hands took it from him with visible effort. He was a small man, Morse, compact, economical in his movements, the kind of man whose physical smallness made people underestimate him until he opened his mouth, at which point they revised their assessment rapidly. He spread his materials across the dining room table after supper, while Rosa moved quietly in the background and Aldous sat in the corner with his arms crossed, and Naomi sat at the far end of the table with her hands folded and her back straight, and Morse went through it. The irregularities in Gannon's debt agreements were more extensive than Colton had known. 3 properties in 2 counties, loans with original interest rates that had somehow become significantly higher by the time the repayment was due, with new documentation that had replaced the original agreements in a way that would have been difficult to prove without the original parties. But 2 of those parties were still alive and had, with considerable encouragement from Morse and some travel expenses covered by Colton, been willing to make sworn statements. "That's fraud," Aldous said from the corner. "That's what it looks like," Morse said carefully. "What it is for a judge to determine. What I can tell you is that when Deputy Marshal Hicks sees this tomorrow, he is going to have a significant amount of material to work with." He looked at Colton. "The staircase situation is less certain. The inquest was local. The records are incomplete in ways that may have been intentional. I've identified 2 people who were in the household at the time who might be willing to speak, but they're afraid of Gannon, and I'm not going to make promises to you about what they'll do." "I understand," Colton said. "What about the Hale agreement?" Naomi asked. Her voice was even. "The debt arrangement Gannon made with my stepmother." Morse looked at her with the attention of a man who took questions seriously regardless of who asked them. "The original loan Gannon made to the Hale estate was at 8% interest, which is high but not fraudulent. What he presented to Mrs. Hale last month showed 12.5%, compounded in a way that inflated the total significantly." He opened a folder. "I have a copy of the original agreement, which I obtained through the county recorder's office. The difference between what was owed under the original terms and what Gannon was claiming is approximately $400. Naomi was quiet for a moment. "She didn't know," she said finally. "She may not have had the original document to compare," Morse said. "Not excusing, just factual." "She should have checked," Aldous said. "Yes," Naomi said quietly. "She should have." A pause. "She was afraid, and she trusted the wrong person, and she didn't check." She looked at her folded hands. "People do that." The room was quiet. Colton looked at her and thought about what it cost to say something fair about a person who had treated you badly, and how that kind of fairness wasn't the same as forgiveness and wasn't the same as excusing, and was its own separate and genuinely difficult thing. Deputy Marshal Hicks arrived at 10 in the morning on Thursday, which was 4 days after the rest of them arrived at Mercer Ridge Ranch simultaneously and in a manner that nobody had planned. What happened was this. Margaret Hale came first, in a hired buggy with Cora beside her, and a driver who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. They arrived at 8:30, and Colton came out to meet them on the porch, and Margaret got down from the buggy with the stiff movements of a woman who had rehearsed what she was going to say and was now confronting the gap between the rehearsal and the reality of actually being here. She looked older than she had at Ashwood, thinner. The brittle brightness was gone. and what was left without it was more complicated. A woman who had genuinely not known the full extent of what she'd agreed to and was now carrying the weight of what she'd done anyway. She looked at Colton. Then she looked past him toward the house. "Is she here?" Margaret said. "Yes," Colton said. Margaret's jaw moved. "I'd like to speak with her." "That'll be her decision," he said. A pause. "I know," Margaret said, which surprised him. He'd expected a version of the authority she'd worn at Ashwood. The insistence on her position, and its absence was unexpected enough that he looked at her more carefully. She looked tired, just thoroughly, completely tired. "I've been told," she said carefully, "about the interest figures. The difference between what was in the original agreement and what Gannon brought to me last month." She stopped. "I should have checked the original document. I knew where it was. I didn't look." She looked at him directly. "I want you to know I didn't understand what I was agreeing to in full. That may not—" She stopped again. "That may not change what I agreed to." "No," he said. "It doesn't. But it's relevant to what happens next." He looked at her. "Come in. There's coffee." Cora had not said anything. She got down from the buggy and stood looking at the ranch with wide eyes and said nothing, which was perhaps the most useful thing she'd contributed to any situation in recent memory. They were in the front room with coffee when Naomi came downstairs. The room went very still. Naomi stopped at the base of the stairs. She looked at her stepmother and her stepsister with an expression that Colton couldn't have named precisely. Not cold, not warm, somewhere in the complicated territory between those things where most of real life actually happened. Margaret stood up. "Naomi," she said, and her voice had an edge to it that Colton realized, after a moment, was not hardness, but the particular quality of someone trying not to lose control of their voice and not quite succeeding. "Mrs. Hale," Naomi said. A silence. "I owe you—" Margaret started and stopped, started again. "There are things I should have—" stopped again. She pressed her lips together. "I made a very bad decision," she said finally. "I made it because I was frightened and I thought I was out of options, and I told myself you were part of the household's problem to solve." Her voice had gone flat, in the way voices go flat, when the flatness is the only thing holding them together. "That was wrong. What I was going to agree to, what I did agree to, was wrong, and I don't expect you to—" She stopped. "I don't expect anything." Cora made a small sound from her chair. Nobody looked at her. Naomi stood at the base of the stairs for a moment. She looked at her stepmother the way she looked at problems she was figuring out, steadily, without flinching, taking it in rather than reacting to it. "I know you were frightened," Naomi said. "I've known that for 2 years." She paused. "I also know that frightened people are still responsible for what they do." She paused again. "I'm not going to tell you it was all right. It wasn't." She came into the room and sat down in the chair across from Margaret. "But I'm also not going to spend the rest of my life being angry at you. I don't have the energy for it, and it won't change anything that happened." Margaret looked at her. Something in her face moved in a way that she clearly hadn't intended. "Delia?" Naomi asked. She stayed in Sulphur Creek," Margaret said. "She's upset." A complicated pause. "She's not entirely sure what she's upset about, I think." "That sounds like Delia," Naomi said, and it wasn't cruel, just accurate. Cora from her chair said very quietly, "I'm sorry, Naomi. What I did, what I let happen. I'm sorry. It came out small and a little ragged, and it had the quality of something that had been prepared but was arriving less polished than intended, which made it more honest than if it had been polished." Naomi looked at her youngest stepsister. Something in her expression shifted. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just the slight shift of someone who is deciding something. "I know, Cora," she said. That was all. But the way she said it, the absence of dismissal in it, the plain acknowledgement, seemed to be enough, because Cora let out a slow breath and looked at her hands. Gannon arrived at 11. He came with more men this time. 4 riders, in addition to the lawyer, and a wagon that had no obvious purpose beyond demonstrating that he'd come prepared for a longer negotiation. He rode up to the gate with the deliberate pacing of a man making an entrance, which told Colton that the 12 days since their first confrontation had not softened Gannon's position so much as reorganized it. What Gannon had not expected was Deputy Marshal Hicks, who had arrived an hour earlier and was currently sitting at Colton's dining room table with Morse's documentation spread in front of him. The hands at the gate sent word to the house, and Colton came out. But this time Aldous walked with him, and Martinez walked with Aldous, despite his wrist still being in a cloth wrap, and Rodriguez and two other hands positioned themselves at various points around the yard with the casual purposefulness of men who had been told to be visible. Gannon took in the configuration of people, and his jaw tightened. "Where is she?" he said. "Inside," Colton said, "with her family." Something shifted in Gannon's face at the word family. A slight recalculation. "I have a legal instrument," the lawyer began, opening the satchel. "There's a deputy marshal from Phoenix inside this house," Colton said. "If you have legal instruments, you're welcome to bring them inside and present them to him." He kept his voice level and his eyes on Gannon. "He'd probably like to speak with you anyway. He has some questions about loan agreements in Maricopa County and Pima County that he thinks you might be able to help clarify." The effect of this on the group in front of him was interesting to observe. The lawyer stopped moving. The four riders exchanged glances. Gannon himself went very still. "What is this?" Gannon said. "It's a federal inquiry," Colton said. "Which is what happens when a territorial office receives documentation of systematic fraud in debt agreements across county lines." He paused. "I'd recommend coming inside. Riding away from a federal deputy doesn't generally help a man's situation." A long, loaded moment. Gannon looked at him with the eyes of a man who understood that the ground had shifted substantially and was deciding in real time what kind of man he was going to be about it. He could push. He had the men. He had the paperwork. He had the county relationships. But he also had a federal deputy marshal sitting in a house 30 feet away with 2 months of documentation in front of him, and the calculus of that was not favorable. "This isn't over," Gannon said. "You said that the last time," Colton replied. "Come inside or ride back, Gannon. Those are the options right now." Another long moment. Then Gannon dismounted. He handed his reins to one of the riders and walked toward the house with his lawyer beside him. And he walked the way men walk when they are maintaining composure that is costing them, each step controlled, the set of his shoulders carrying the particular tension of a man who has not yet decided to back down, but has decided to defer the not backing down to a more strategic moment. Colton watched him pass and then followed. Backed. What happened in the next 2 hours in the dining room of Mercer Ridge Ranch was not a dramatic confrontation. It was considerably less cinematic and considerably more grinding than that. The methodical work of a federal deputy going through documentation with both parties present, asking specific questions in the flat, patient voice of a man who had done this before and understood that the truth came out through repetition and detail rather than through moments of revelation. Hicks was not impressive in the usual ways. He was medium height, medium build, late 40s, with a mustache that had given up on one side. He spoke quietly. He asked the same question 3 different ways at different points in the proceeding, which Colton recognized as deliberate. He was checking answers for consistency with the patience of a man who trusted process more than performance. Gannon answered questions with his lawyer beside him, and the lawyer's presence did what lawyers' presences do, which was to slow the proceedings and carefully qualify each answer, and at no point did Gannon say anything that was openly incriminating. He was too experienced for that. But Hicks had Morse's documentation, and Morse's documentation had the original loan agreements with the original figures. And at 2 separate points in the examination, when Hicks laid a document in front of Gannon and asked him to explain the difference between 2 sets of numbers, the silence that followed each question was longer than silence should be when the answer is innocent. Naomi sat in the room for all of it. She had not been asked to. She had simply come in and taken a chair near the wall, and Hicks had looked at her and she had said, "I'm Naomi Hale." And he had nodded and returned to his documents, and she sat through the entire 2 hours with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her eyes on whoever was speaking, and Colton thought that her being in the room was not nothing, that there was something about her presence, the simple fact of her sitting there visible and unintimidated, that had weight in that room whether or not a word was said about her specifically. At the end of it, Hicks gathered his documents and told Gannon that he should expect further contact from the territorial office within 30 days, and that he should make himself available for additional questions, and that he should not make any new debt agreements with any parties in this territory pending the completion of the inquiry. He said all of this in the same flat, patient voice, and then he asked Gannon to leave so he could speak with Colton and Morse privately. Gannon stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Naomi once, just once, directly, and she looked back at him without flinching, and whatever he'd expected to find in her face, the expression he found there was not it, and after a moment he looked away. He walked out. The wagon and riders that had accompanied him drove back down the main road, and this time Colton did not stand watching them with the feeling of something unfinished. This time it felt like what it was, a man retreating from a position that had become untenable, not because he'd been defeated dramatically, but because the ground had been methodically removed from under him by documentation and patience and a federal deputy with a flat voice and a thorough understanding of compound interest calculations. Hicks stayed for another hour. He asked Colton about the property line dispute with Graydon, which had not been why Colton wrote to Phoenix, but Hicks had apparently read the letter carefully and had his own files on Graydon. He asked Morse about the two witnesses who were afraid. He asked Naomi 3 questions directly. When had she left Ashwood? What had she taken with her? Had anyone made any threats to her personally? And she answered each one with the same plain accuracy she brought to everything, and Hicks wrote it down. When he left, he shook Colton's hand and then Morse's hand, and then, somewhat to Colton's surprise, Naomi's hand. "Miss Hale," he said, "I appreciate your time." "Thank you, Marshal," she said. He put on his hat and rode north. Rosa appeared from the kitchen almost immediately with coffee and a plate of food that suggested she'd been preparing it for some time and had been waiting only for the official portions of the afternoon to conclude. She set it on the table and looked at the state of the room. The chairs slightly displaced, the tension still hanging in the air the way tension does after it's been the dominant atmosphere for a while. And she said, "Everybody sit down," in the tone of a woman who has fed people through difficult things before and intends to do it again now. Everybody sat down. Margaret Hale sat at one end of the table. Naomi sat at the other end. Between them, in various configurations, were Colton and Morse and Aldous and Cora and Rosa herself, who sat down after she'd poured everything, which she rarely did but which felt right today. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Cora reached for the bread, and the small normality of that broke something loose in the room, and Aldous said something about the north fence in his dry way, and Morse made a small observation about the coffee, and the room began to do what rooms do when the hard part is over. Not exactly relax, because the aftermath of a hard thing isn't relaxation. It's something more like the deliberate resumption of ordinary motion. People eating, cups being lifted, the particular sound of a meal among people who have been through something together. Naomi looked down the table at her stepmother. Margaret was eating with the careful movements of a woman who was not sure of her welcome and was aware of it, and was trying to take up as little space as possible, which was so thoroughly unlike her that Naomi watched it for a moment, with something moving in her chest that she couldn't completely identify. "The interest figures," Naomi said. "The $400 Gannon inflated the debt by." She looked at Margaret carefully. Morse says there are grounds to recalculate the actual amount owed under the original terms. Margaret looked up. "It won't eliminate the debt," Naomi said, "but it'll reduce it, and Morse knows a lawyer in Tucson who does honest work." A pause. "You should talk to him." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Her throat moved. "Why are you telling me this?" Naomi was quiet for a second. "Because my father built that ranch," she said. "And I'd rather see it survive than see it disappear because of $400 that were invented out of someone else's greed." She looked at her plate. "That's not forgiveness. That's just priorities." Margaret nodded once. It was a small nod. It was the nod of a woman accepting something that she understood she had not earned, and knowing it, and not pretending otherwise. "Thank you," she said. Naomi picked up her fork. That evening, after Margaret and Cora had been given rooms for the night, the house was large enough, and the alternative was riding back to Sulphur Creek in the dark, which nobody suggested. Colton found Naomi at the fence on the east side of the property, leaning against the top rail and looking out at the darkening range. He came and leaned beside her, not close, just near enough to be present. "Long day," he said. "Long several weeks," she said. They stood there in the cooling air. The sky had gone from orange to deep blue at the edges, and the first stars were sharp above the horizon. Somewhere in the north pasture, a coyote called once and went quiet. "Are you all right?" he asked. She thought about it. He appreciated that she actually thought about it rather than giving the reflexive answer. "I'm tired," she said, "and She paused. "I feel like something that's been pulled tight for a very long time has let go, and I'm not entirely sure what shape I am underneath it." She looked out at the range. "That's probably going to take a while to sort out." "Yes," he said. "I'd imagine so." A pause. "You were right," she said, "about building the case, about the documents and Morse and Hicks. All of it." She glanced at him sideways. "I didn't doubt you exactly, but I also didn't know that it would work. I've spent a long time around situations where having the right on your side didn't count for as much as having the power. It doesn't always work," he said honestly. "This one worked because Morse is thorough and Gannon got greedy, and a deputy marshal from Phoenix happened to be someone who cared about his work." He paused. "A different combination of factors, and we're having a different day today." "That's not a comfortable thing to say." "No," he agreed, "but it's true. And I'd rather be honest with you about it than let you think the world is more just than it is." She looked at him. "You really do not know how to present yourself favorably, do you?" "I've been told that," he said, "multiple times, by people whose opinions I respected." And yet, he agreed. She almost smiled, and then did, more than the corner of the mouth version, this one reaching further, and he saw in it something that hadn't been there at Ashwood, not even in the glimpses, something that had more room now, more air around it. He looked away before he made it into something it didn't need to be yet. "What will you do?" he said carefully, "when the dust settles? When Gannon's situation is resolved and the Hales are back at Ashwood and the inquiry is finished?" He kept his voice neutral, making it a genuine question rather than the preamble to something else. "What do you want?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I want to stay," she said. Then, immediately, I'm aware that's not a simple answer given everything." "No," he said, "it's not simple." He looked at the range. "But it's honest, and I've found I prefer honest to simple." She turned and looked at him. He turned and looked at her. Between them was 3 weeks of living in proximity to someone's real self. Not performed, not arranged, not the version a person shows to a stranger they're trying to impress, but the version that emerges when the situation is hard and there's no time for performance. "I don't know what I am here," she said. "Guest, charity case, something else. I've been trying to figure out what to call it." "You could just call it what it is," he said. "Which is what?" He considered his words with some care. "A woman who showed up 3 weeks ago and has been making this place work better without making a show of it, who handles difficult situations without falling apart and handles the falling apart without making it everyone else's problem, and who is—" He stopped. "I'm going to say this plainly, because I said I'd be honest with you, and I intend to keep that." She waited. "I want you to stay because I want you to stay," he said. "Not as a guest and not as a charity case and not as a—" He paused. "I'm not asking you for anything right now. I'm telling you something that's true, and I'm telling you that the rest of it, whatever the rest of it is, can go at whatever pace makes sense." He met her eyes. "But I didn't want you to be unclear about where I stand." She looked at him for a long moment, the evening settling around them. "I'm not unclear," she said. He nodded. She looked back out at the range, and he looked out at the range beside her, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And the stars kept appearing, one at a time, patient and indifferent and numerous, the way they always did over this land, regardless of what was happening beneath them. The stars that had appeared one at a time over the east pasture, while Colton and Naomi stood at the fence that evening, were gone by morning, replaced by a low gray sky that promised rain without delivering it. The kind of Arizona morning that couldn't quite commit to what it wanted to be. Naomi noticed this from the kitchen window while the coffee was heating and thought that it was a reasonable description of several things in her life at the moment, not just the weather. Margaret and Cora left after breakfast. The departure was not warm exactly, but it was no longer the jagged, armored thing it had been when they'd arrived the previous morning. Margaret shook Naomi's hand at the door. Not an embrace, not the performance of reconciliation that neither of them had the energy for, just a handshake, firm and brief and honest. And she said, "I'll write to the lawyer in Tucson." And Naomi said, "Good." And that was the shape of it. Not resolution, not the clean closing of a wound, more like two people acknowledging that they would have to figure out how to exist in proximity to each other over the long run, and that the long run had not yet begun, and that today they were simply managing the distance between what had happened and whatever came next. Cora hugged her. That was more complicated in its way. Cora's arms around her, Cora's genuine distress, the faint smell of her hair that was the same as it had been when they were younger, and Cora had occasionally, quietly, been kind. Naomi held still and let her, and when Cora pulled back, her eyes were red, and Naomi's were not, which she didn't think made her the stronger person, just the more tired one. She stood on the porch and watched the buggy go down the road and out through the gate, and she stayed there until it was out of sight, and then she went inside and refilled her coffee and sat at the kitchen table alone for a while. Rosa came in, took one look at her, and sat down across from her without a word. They sat there together in the quiet kitchen for several minutes, the coffee steaming between them. "You know," Rosa said eventually, "the first year I worked here, I thought this place was going to break me. The work was hard, and Mr. Mercer, the father, was not an easy man, very demanding, very certain he was right about everything." Naomi looked at her. Rosa rarely talked about the history of the place in any personal way. "What changed?" Naomi asked. "I decided I belonged here," Rosa said simply. "I stopped waiting for someone to tell me. I just decided." She picked up her cup. "That's not nothing. Deciding is not nothing." Naomi looked at her coffee. "Is that advice?" "It's an observation," Rosa said. "You can do whatever you want with it." She got up and went back to the stove, and Naomi sat with the observation and found that it fit the shape of something she'd been thinking about without quite naming, the way a tool fits a hand that didn't know it was looking for it. The 30 days that Hicks had specified came and went, and then another 30, and the inquiry moved the way official inquiries moved, slowly, with long silences between developments, and then suddenly, and all at once. Morse wrote twice in the first month, with updates that were cautious and procedural. The territorial office had requested additional documentation. Two of the parties Gannon had defrauded in Pima County had come forward formally. The investigation into the third wife's death had been reopened by the county court in Maricopa, which Morse described as significant in the understated way he described most significant things. In the second month, the letter came that changed the shape of everything. Gannon had entered into a negotiated agreement with the territorial office. He would repay, with correct interest, the amounts owed to 3 defrauded parties. He would transfer 2 properties that had been improperly acquired. He would cooperate with the Maricopa County inquiry, and in exchange the territorial fraud charges would be settled without trial, pending his full compliance with the terms. He was not going to prison. That was the first thing Naomi thought when Colton read it aloud to her at the kitchen table. She sat with that for a moment. The man who had sat across from her stepmother with his leather satchel and his bent-shouldered lawyer. The man who had looked at her across a dining room with the assessing eyes of someone calculating value. He was going to pay some money and transfer some land and cooperate with some officials, and that was going to be the shape of his consequence. "He's not going to prison," she said. "No," Colton said, "probably not." She looked at the letter. "Look, is that what justice looks like?" He was quiet for a moment, which she had come to understand meant he was thinking about whether to give her the honest answer or the comforting one, and that the honest answer usually arrived when the pause was that length. "Sometimes," he said, "the Maricopa inquiry is still ongoing. That could change things. But in general, men with resources and existing relationships with the legal system don't tend to face the full weight of what they've done. Not as a rule." He paused. "What they do tend to face is the loss of the tool they used. Gannon's ability to use fraudulent debt as a lever is gone. The people who knew about him but said nothing now know that someone will look, and that documentation matters, and that there are people willing to make the trip to Phoenix. He looked at her. That's not nothing. It's not everything, she said. No, it's not everything. He met her eyes. It rarely is. She was quiet for a moment, sitting with the gap between what she'd wanted and what had actually happened. She'd spent enough of her life in that gap to know its dimensions. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't foreign either. The Hale debt, she said. The 400 that was inflated. Gannon's restitution terms include returning inflated amounts to all parties. Margaret Hale is on the list. She nodded slowly. She'll keep the ranch then, if she's careful. If she's careful, he agreed. Morse says the underlying debt is manageable if she restructures it over 5 years. She'll have to reduce expenses and work the operation harder, but it's survivable. Naomi thought about her father building that barn, about the 2 weeks he'd spent putting up the beams himself, coming in each evening with sawdust in his hair and an expression of tired satisfaction that she'd thought, as a 12-year-old, was the most adult thing she'd ever seen. Work that made something real. Something that stood. Good, she said, and she meant it, which was complicated, and she let it be complicated without trying to resolve the complication into something cleaner. Fahamed. She had been at Mercer Ridge for 4 months when she figured out, clearly and without ambiguity, what she wanted to do. It came to her not in a single moment of clarity, but gradually, the way most real things came to her, through the accumulation of small observations over time. She'd been helping Rosa manage the household accounts, which had fallen behind during Colton's weeks away, and which had a persistent problem with the way feed costs were being tracked against inventory. She'd reorganized the system over the course of 2 weeks, quietly, without announcing it, and when Aldous noticed the improvement and said something to Colton about it, Colton had asked her how she'd done it. She'd explained it. He'd listened the way he listened, actually following the logic. You could run this whole operation's books, he said. You know that. I know, she said, which wasn't vanity, just accuracy. Is that something you'd want to do? She looked at him. I'd want to do more than the books, she said. I'd want to be involved in the decisions, the cattle management, the water allocation, the pasture rotation, the things you and Aldous talk about in the barn every morning. He raised an eyebrow slightly. You know about those conversations? Sound carries in the morning, she said, and you don't close the barn door completely. He looked at her for a moment, and she watched him not be surprised by this, which was one of the things she'd noticed about him. He was rarely surprised by her competence, which was different from most people she'd encountered and which had taken her a while to stop waiting for the exception to. Then sit in on them, he said, starting tomorrow. That's it? What else do you want me to say? She thought about it. Nothing, I suppose. I was expecting more resistance. I'm not in the business of resisting useful people, he said, particularly ones who already know what they're doing. She looked at him steadily. Colton. Naomi. You said 4 months ago, at the fence, that you wanted me to stay, and that the rest of it could go at whatever pace made sense. She kept her voice even. I want to say something about the rest of it. He went still, not tense, still, the specific stillness of a man who is paying close attention. I've been waiting, she said. I think I've been waiting to see if this place was real. If what I saw at Ashwood, through 12 days of watching a man in a bad shirt work and speak honestly, was the actual person or whether it was what pressure looks like from the outside and it would turn out differently here. She paused. It's not different here. You are the same person in both places, which is rarer than it should be. He said nothing. She hadn't finished. I'm also not the same person I was at Ashwood, she said. Or I am, but there's more of me available now, more that I can actually see. She looked at her hands. I don't know exactly what I'm worth when I'm not surviving something. I'm starting to find out. And it turns out the finding out requires being somewhere that isn't trying to use me up. She looked at him. This is that somewhere. Yes, he said quietly. It is. So, she said, the rest of it. He looked at her. There was a quality in his face that she'd seen once or twice before, not the composed, managing expression he wore when there were things to handle, but the actual face underneath it, which was more uncertain and more honest and more real. I'm not good at this, he said. At the saying of it, Claire used to tell me I express things better through the doing than the saying, and she wasn't wrong. I'm not asking for a speech, she said. I know. He looked at her steadily. I know what I want. I've known for a while. What I've been waiting for is to be certain that you had time and room enough to know what you want without the weight of the situation making the decision for you. And if I told you I know, then I'd believe you, he said, because I've never seen you say anything you didn't mean. She felt something move in her chest that was not the tight, braced feeling she'd carried for years, but something different, something that had room around it, space on all sides, air. I mean this, she said. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her hands, and she let him. And they stood there in the ordinary light of an ordinary afternoon in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and wood smoke and the lingering ghost of Rosa's bread, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there wasn't anything that needed saying. He asked her properly 6 weeks later, not in the kitchen. Outside on a September afternoon when the air had finally broken from the summer heat and gone cool and clear under the old cottonwood at the eastern edge of the house yard that Rosa had told her was the oldest tree on the property planted by the original settlers of the land before the Mercers ever arrived. He didn't make a production of it. He didn't have a speech prepared. She'd believe that when she saw it, and she saw it, because what he had was the slightly stiff, slightly fumbling quality of a man doing something he genuinely wasn't practiced at, and she found that more reassuring than any polished delivery would have been. He held her hand and he said, I want to build something with you. A life that's actually built, not one that I inherited or you stumbled into. I want to know what you think every morning and argue with you about the pasture rotation and watch you improve things I've stopped seeing clearly because I've looked at them too long. He paused. I want you to have something that is unambiguously yours. This place, these people, this work. Another pause. I want to marry you, Naomi, if you'll have me. She looked at him under the cottonwood with the September light coming through the leaves and the ranch spread out around them making its ordinary sounds, and she thought about her father saying every woman ought to have one thing that is unambiguously hers, and she thought about the kitchen floor at Ashwood and the bread pan and Delia walking out of the room, and she thought about a man in a terrible shirt walking through the gate and asking for work, and how none of it had looked like what it was while it was happening, and how most of the important things in a life don't. Yes, she said, simply, directly, the way she said everything. Of course, yes. He didn't look relieved exactly. He looked like a man who has set down something that has been heavy and is adjusting to the absence of the weight. They stood there under the old cottonwood while the afternoon moved around them. The shirt really was terrible, she said. He laughed, an actual laugh, full and unguarded, the kind she'd heard occasionally now, but that still had the quality of something worth paying attention to. I borrowed it from a hand who'd been traveling for 2 weeks. It showed. I thought it helped me look the part. It made you look like someone who had lost an argument with a fence, she said, which, to be fair, was occasionally accurate during those 2 weeks. The fence won that one, he admitted, fair and square. She was smiling, and he was smiling, and behind them the house stood solid against the afternoon sky, the same house it had been the day she arrived, and different in every way that actually mattered. Then, they were married in the first week of October, in a ceremony that was small because both of them preferred small, and neither of them had the patience for large. Aldous stood for Colton with the expression of a man who is moved and determined not to show it, and not entirely succeeding. Rosa cried straightforwardly and without embarrassment, which was characteristic. Martinez brought his wife and his son with the healed wrist, and Rodriguez came with his brother, and several of the hands stood in the yard in their good clothes, with the slightly formal posture of men not used to wearing their good clothes. Morse came. He made the ride from Tucson, which was 2 days, and he arrived the evening before and ate supper with them and said, "I'm glad this worked out," in the tone of a man who was describing a legal outcome, and also something more than a legal outcome. Cora came. She rode out alone without Delia, who had sent a letter that was polite in the way letters are polite when the writer is not ready to be anything more than polite. And Naomi had read the letter and set it aside and not been more disappointed than she'd expected to be. Cora arrived with pink in her cheeks from the road and a small wrapped package that turned out to be a pair of embroidered pillowcases that she'd done herself, imperfectly, with obvious effort, And when Naomi thanked her for them, Cora said, "They're not very good." And Naomi said, "They're very good." And that was as close to sisterhood as either of them had managed so far, which was something rather than nothing and might, with enough time and the right conditions, become something more. Margaret did not come. She sent a letter that was longer than Cora's and more honest and harder to read, and Naomi read it twice and put it in the drawer of her desk. The desk that was now hers, in a room that was now hers, in a house that was now hers. And she sat with it for a while before she went downstairs to help Rosa with the wedding dinner. She didn't talk about the letter. Colton didn't ask. That was one of the things about him she'd come to count on. He knew the difference between a silence that was asking to be broken and a silence that needed to be let alone. What she had not expected in the months that followed was how strange it felt to simply live. Not unhappy strange. Strange the way anything feels when you've been prepared for difficulty for so long that the absence of it is its own kind of adjustment. She woke in the mornings, and the first several seconds of each day had a quality of waiting. The old reflex, the reaching for what needed to be carried today, who needed what she'd failed to do yesterday that someone would punish her for today. And then she'd become aware of where she was, and the quality of the light in the room, and Colton's breathing beside her, and the sounds of the ranch beginning its day outside the window, and the reflex would ease off and leave behind something quieter. She wasn't an easy person to live with. She knew this, and she didn't pretend otherwise. She had opinions about how things should be done, and she stated them plainly, and she didn't always get it right. And when she was wrong, she said so, but she wasn't good at being wrong gracefully. She was good at acknowledging it and then moving forward, which was not quite the same thing. She had a temper that ran cold rather than hot. She didn't shout. She went quiet, and according to Colton, quiet. Naomi was considerably more formidable than shouting would have been. They argued about the pasture rotation. She had been right, it turned out, about moving the south herd earlier in the season, and she made sure he knew she'd been right, and he said, "You were right," in the flat voice of a man who was saying it honestly and didn't require embellishment, which was the correct response and which she gave him credit for. They argued about finances. She thought they should increase the operating reserve before expanding the cattle operation. He thought expansion now would serve the reserve better in the long run. They went back and forth for 3 weeks and arrived at a middle position that was arguably better than either of their original positions, which was irritating to both of them and which they did not say aloud, but each knew the other was thinking. She sat in on the morning barn conversations. She contributed. At first, Aldous received her contributions with the careful neutrality of a man reserving judgment, and then with the more genuine engagement of a man who had decided the judgment was favorable, and then simply as a matter of course. Naomi said something, Aldous responded to it, Colton added to it, and the decision emerged from the three of them rather than from one. This took about 4 months and was, she thought, one of the more satisfying developments of her first year. The news about Gannon came in the spring. The Maricopa County inquiry had concluded. The findings regarding his third wife's death had been formally submitted to the county court, and the court had determined that the circumstances warranted a criminal charge. Gannon was arrested in March, not in Arizona, but in New Mexico, where he'd relocated following the territorial settlement. Morse wrote with the details, and Colton read the letter at breakfast, and he passed it to Naomi without comment. She read it. She set it down. She thought about the staircase, about a woman she'd never met whose death had been ruled an accident by a local inquest, because some inquests are conducted by people who know which side of a verdict is easier. She thought about the 2 other wives and wondered what their endings had been. She thought about her stepmother sitting across from Gannon with the original loan document somewhere in a drawer she hadn't thought to open. "It took a long time," she said. "Yes," Colton said. "Is that I feel like I should feel more." He looked at her. "What do you feel?" She thought about it. "Tired," she said, and relieved, and angry that it took this long and this much for anyone to look at him seriously. She paused. "And something for those women that I don't have a word for." "Grief," Colton said quietly. "For strangers. It's allowed." She looked at him across the table. He had a line between his brows that wasn't there a year ago, which she'd given him, she suspected, or at least contributed to, and which she found she did not regret because it was the line of a man who was engaged with the reality of things, rather than maintaining a careful distance from them. Yes, she said. Grief. They sat with that for a moment, the morning light coming through the kitchen windows, Rosa moving quietly in the background. Then Naomi picked up her coffee. I want to write to Morse. I want to find out if either of the families of his other wives know what happened, if they've been told. Colton looked at her. That could open things that are painful. I know, she said. They should know anyway. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he nodded. I'll ask Morse to make inquiries. She nodded back. That was how they made decisions. Not always easily, not always without friction, but honestly, each of them taking the other seriously enough to actually hear them, which was something she had not known, for most of her life, to expect. The cottonwood in the house yard lost its leaves in November and got them back in April, and by the second spring it was a familiar landmark in the way that things become landmarks through the simple accumulation of days spent looking at them. She had a habit, in the early morning before anyone else was up, of standing at the kitchen window with her coffee and looking out at it, the old tree in the early light, the way it moved in the wind that came down from the north. It was under that tree, on a warm evening in May of the second year, that Aldous told her he was thinking of leaving. He didn't say retiring. He said leaving, which was the honest word, because he wasn't the kind of man to dress things up. His sister in California, a widowed woman with land of her own, had asked him to come and help her with it, and he was 52, and he had done this work for a long time, and he was ready to do it somewhere different. Naomi listened to him tell her before he told Colton, which was not something she'd anticipated, and which she understood to be a significant thing in its own quiet way. When are you going to tell him? She asked. Tonight, Aldous said. I wanted to tell you first, in case... He paused. You'll take over the management well. I want you to know I think that. She looked at him. Aldous was not a demonstrative man. His version of this conversation was the most warmth she'd seen from him in 2 years, which didn't mean the warmth wasn't real. Thank you, she said. Don't let him be stubborn about the pasture rotation, Aldous said. He still thinks the old schedule is fine. He knows it's not fine, she said. He just doesn't like to admit it. Aldous made the small sound that was his version of a laugh. No, he doesn't. He looked at the cottonwood. Good tree, he said. Good tree, she agreed. He went to find Colton, and Naomi stayed under the cottonwood for a while in the evening air, and she thought about what Aldous had said and what it meant and what came next, and underneath those thoughts, running steady as water in a good well, was the bedrock fact of where she was standing and who she was now, and how much ground there was between here and Ashwood Ranch, and everything that place had meant. She had worked all her life. She had given that work to people who had taken it and given her nothing in return but continued demands. And then she had walked away, had been brave enough or desperate enough or both, which were not always different things, and had found that the work she'd always done meant something different when it was given to a place and people that gave something back. Not just wages, not just a room, but the daily acknowledgement that what she did mattered, that her judgment had weight, that the things she knew were worth knowing. People talked about finding yourself as if the self was something separate from the life you built around it. She didn't think that was right. She thought you made yourself in the choosing, what you walked away from, what you walked toward, what you picked up, and what you set down. She had spent 26 years becoming the person who could walk out of a barn at 4 a.m. with a canvas bag and a brown horse and 2 weeks of evidence that a stranger might be worth trusting. That person had been there all along. She just needed somewhere with enough room to be her actual size. Chess. Colton found her still at the cottonwood after dark, which he had started to understand was a place she went when she was thinking through something large. He came and stood beside her. He was good at that, at the standing beside rather than the standing in front of, and she thought it was probably the most underrated quality a person could have in a partner. Aldous told me, he said. I know. He told you first. He did. Colton was quiet for a moment. We're going to need to find someone, or promote from within. Rodriguez is capable. Rodriguez is more than capable, she said. He's been doing half the foreman's work for 2 years without the title. You've noticed that. I notice most things, she said. You know this about me. I do know this about you, he agreed with the slight dryness that was his version of affection and that she had come to read clearly. She leaned her shoulder against his arm. He shifted to accommodate the weight of it, the small automatic adjustment of two people who have been in proximity long enough that their bodies have worked out an agreement. We should give him the title and the wages that go with it, she said. Past due, actually. Agreed. They stood there in the dark under the old tree. Naomi, he said. Yes. Are you happy? She thought about it with the honesty she brought to every question, the refusal to give the reflexive answer when the real one was available. Yes, she said. Not every day. Some days are hard, and some days I'm still figuring out how to be a person who isn't bracing for something. She paused. But, yes, underneath all the days, yes. He put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned against him. Good, he said. Simple, direct, meaning it completely. The ranch was settling into night around them. The sounds of animals in the barn, a lamplit in the bunkhouse window, the smell of wood smoke from the cookhouse where someone had stayed up late. All of it ordinary. All of it real. All of it built out of daily choices rather than a single decisive moment, which was how most things that lasted were actually built. Not in one grand gesture, but in the accumulation of small, honest ones. She thought about the man she'd first seen riding through the gate in that terrible borrowed shirt, the way he'd walked over to the fence line she was working on and picked up a post and said, "Hand me the wire," without making it into anything more than what it was. She thought about crouching in the vegetable garden at Ashwood with Gannon's voice coming through the walls of the house, and a man she'd known 8 days telling her, "You've got somewhere to go." She thought about what it had cost her to trust that, and what it had given her in return, and how those two things were still not equal in the way a ledger wants things to be equal, because life was not a ledger, and the truest things in it did not balance neatly, but instead accumulated unevenly, unpredictably, in the spaces between what you planned and what actually happened. She was not the girl who had been pushed against the kitchen wall while a clay pot shattered on the floor. Or she was still, underneath everything. Still the person who had learned to hold a bleeding palm against an apron and stay quiet and keep moving. But she was also more than that person now, and the more had been built through the same hands that had done all the other building, which meant it was hers in a way that nothing given or inherited could be. That was the thing nobody told you when you were young, that the hardest life sometimes made you the most capable of the right one, if you could manage to survive it without letting it convince you that you deserved no better. She was still working on that last part. She expected she'd be working on it for a long time. Under the cottonwood, in the dark, Colton's arm was warm across her shoulders, and the stars were coming out one at a time again, the same stars that had appeared over the east pasture the night she'd told him she was not unclear. And they were not romantic or symbolic. They were just stars, cold and distant and indifferent, doing what they did regardless of what was happening below them. She was glad to be below them, on this ground, in this life. That was enough. In the end, that was everything.